All right, hey everybody, it's Kyle here, and today we'll be talking about the newest Star Wars book, Star Wars, the Path of Deceit.
Mm.
It's a YA book, kind of kicking off Phase 2 of the High Republic, and excited to be joined by another Star Wars town today. Kind of have a little group discussion about it. So I'm going to throw it to my guest today and let them introduce themselves and also tell me a little bit about their YouTube channel. So Nick, why don't you start first?
Sure. Hey, I am one half of Nick and Melo's Hyperspace. Me and Carmelo met on a Facebook group online about Star Wars books, and we hit it off and decided to do a podcast. And we've been doing it. This is our second year doing our podcast now, so we're currently on our season two, as we're calling it. And yeah, having a lot of fun with it and really enjoying it. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got.
And I am the other half of Nick and Melo's Hyperspace. My name is Carmelo. I am based in Chicago, so I am the northerner today. And we do about 9 episodes for every season, and we usually do sort of really large, either really large topics or decide to focus on a theme or character study. Nick is a big comics fan, so we've been doing some episodes on comics as well. So it's been a treat. It's been a treat.
Awesome. So a lot of times when I meet, I guess Star Wars book fans in real life, one thing I always like to know is like, when did you start reading Star Wars books? Because one thing I've learned as a big Star Wars book nerd fan, because when I was becoming a Star Wars fan, that was all the only new content was Star Wars books. So that's always kind of big my biggest fandom. But when I mentioned to casual fans, they're like, "They're Star Wars books. That's the thing." It's like, "Oh yeah, I've read over 100," and they're like, "What? There's over 100?" So I'm always curious, like, how did you fall in love with Star Wars books?
Nick, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. So when I was growing up, I didn't really have access to a lot of the new Star Wars books. Just usually whatever my local library had or my school had. But the first Star Wars novel I actually read completely. I was in high school and I read the Darth Plagueis book when it just came out. The local library by my house had a copy. I got it one summer and spent like a whole weekend reading it, and it was the coolest thing ever. And then when I became an adult, by the time that happened, they had kind of restarted the expanded universe, and then I kind of just jumped on board and been there ever since.
Awesome.
Awesome.
I'm very late to reading. I am old enough that I was alive for the first movie, and for me, Star Wars was film. And I was a film major, and I teach film. And it was not until 2017 where I was at a convention in Chicago, C2E2, and I met Timothy Zahn. And he was all by himself in this little table. Nobody was talking to him. And I sort of knew the name, but I had never read his books. And so we started chatting, and I said, "What should I start with?" And he said, "Start with my new Throne novel."
Yeah.
And so my very first book was the first book of this newish trilogy, not the very latest one. So I've been reading since 2017, and I'm not going to move my camera, but I have read a lot. I have read a lot, and when in 2019 I got a book contract to write a book about Star Wars, that was the perfect excuse to be reading all the time and adding to my collection. So I consider myself a Star Wars fiction fan, even though I've only been doing it for 5 years.
It's very impressive. I'll kind of brief refresher on how I got involved with it. Again, when I was born in the early 80s. So like when I was becoming a Star Wars fan, there was no new content. You just were rewatching the old movies. And luckily I had an older sister who was a big Star Wars fan. So she got me to watch the movies. And then about the time I would started, getting in middle school was right when they published the Young Jedi Knight series, which was their kind of YA
Oh
first
yeah.
thing. And those were
Uh-huh.
the first kind of like somewhat serious books I'd ever read. And then a couple years after that came out, I remember my sister saying one day, like, "Hey, there's this new Star Wars book out by somebody named Timothy Zahn called Heir of the Empire. Why don't you read it?" And then it just hooked me right away. And then for the rest of since then, me and my sister been diehard Star Wars book fans. Like when we were still in high school and college, we'd actually take turns buying the books because it was too expensive for each of us to buy a copy. So like she'd buy a copy, I'd buy a copy, and we'd trade off. she doesn't really like to save books. I do, so luckily I actually inherited most of the books she did, so I can up and down mine. But like I have an
Yes, we
entire
can
Star
see.
Wars
We can see. That's
book
great.
That's awesome.
bookshelf. Sadly, because of how much they're publishing on the High Republic, I'm fixing to outgrow this shelf, and I've been very confused the last few months as I try to figure out how I can display my Star Wars books without splitting them into multiple shelves. So I'm still trying to figure that. I think that's something I'm actually going to work on in the holidays, the next few weeks, to try to figure out like how can I display these books, knowing that the High Republic is going to be publishing so many books nonstop
Right.
now. Not only to mention all the other Star Wars stuff. So
Right.
I'm glad that at least phase 2 is a little shorter than phase 1,
yeah,
so there won't be
Yes.
as many books.
yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So before we get, I guess, started this book that kicks off phase 2, briefly, what were y'all's thoughts on phase 1? I absolutely loved it. I'd always been kind of going back to Timmy's on that the Heir to the Empire, the first Thrawn trilogy, was my favorite Star Wars books ever, and I didn't think anything would ever come close. And the first phase of the High Republic to me is right there with it.
Oh,
I've
wow.
I've actually been thinking I need to go back and reread the original trilogy because it's been a few years since I did that. Reread the original trilogy and then reread phase 1 again and kind of decide like what's my favorite now. But I absolutely loved it. So, what were y'all thoughts on phase 1?
Nick?
I'll start. Yeah.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's been probably my favorite thing Star Wars has done the last couple of years. Ever since Disney bought Star Wars, I kind of wanted something new and exciting. And I'm not really a fan of nostalgia per se, but I felt like the High Republic's been perfect for giving us something familiar but also new. And I absolutely love Jedi. That's my favorite part of Star Wars, and getting to see the diverse cast of new Jedi and how they interpret the Force has been like really impressive. And the writing has been awesome. Each book, I feel like it's just taking turns that I don't expect.
I have loved reading the fiction and the comics together.
Mhm.
And it's been so much fun sort of seeing the interactions between the characters and the stories between them. I agree. This was a phenomenon for me, and it was just so much fun reading all these books and getting so much new material. I was in one of our podcasts, Nick and I were talking about High Republic, and I was overwhelmed by how many characters I had to keep track of. That was a challenge for me. But I love the writing, and I adored the young adult novels in phase 1. I thought they were, I would say, some of the best young adult novels that have been published since they started doing the YA series of any Star Wars novels, of any Star Wars novel. I'm really excited, and I'm really looking forward to phase 2. And this is fireworks.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll say like I was skeptical when they released the series because typically I think because I'd fell in love with Star Wars books probably through Timothy's on and everything was kind of after Return of the Jedi. I would always preferred reading stuff afterwards and kind of looking forward. So when they announced, it's like I'm a little skeptical. I'll get the first book just. And I did think I'd like it. And the first half, The Lie of the Jedi. If you haven't read that book, the first half of that book is nonstop action for like 200 pages, and I was hooked immediately. It's like, well, I'll read the adult novels. And I was like, oh, I guess I'll get the first YA book just to see, but I'm sure I won't end up doing that. And then first YA book, I'm like, well, this is amazing too. If you didn't tell me this was YA, I wouldn't think it's YA. It's like, then I'm like, well, I'll get the middle school books too. And the middle school books are really cool as well. So
Yeah.
I was so impressed with how they did it, how obviously well thought out it was, given that they had multiple authors. It didn't feel disjointed at all the amazing characters, which to me, that was the other thing I was a little worried about. I was like, well, all these characters, how are they going to make you care about all these? And, there's instantly 30, 40 characters you love. So they did an amazing job. And I know since phase 1 ended, I was very much looking forward to phase 2, but I was also somewhat wondering how I'd like it, given that they made the unique decision of doing phase 2 as a prequel to phase 1, and it's setting a couple hundred years before, or so 150 years before phase 1. It's like, what? How is this going to work? But at least for the first book, I think is off to a great start, and I really enjoyed it. I'm already kind of curious after reading the first book. If you haven't read the series yet, would you recommend people starting, with phase 2 now and then going back and reading phase 1, or since it's chronological? But to me, it's hard to know until they finish phase 2. But I think you're
Right.
going to have that choice. It's kind of like with the movies.
I would do phase 1 first because part of the excitement of reading Path of Deceit was knowing what I know of Phase One.
Yeah.
And there are many moments in this novel that I just would not catch.
Yeah.
If I had not read Phase One. So I mean, it's original trilogy, prequel trilogy, sequel trilogy. It's
exactly. It's
they're
the
doing
same
the
debate
same
again.
structure.
Yeah,
They're doing
yeah.
the same structure.
Yeah, yeah.
But I would definitely recommend for the audience to start with Phase One and then move on to Phase Two.
Mhm.
That's my opinion.
Yeah. And I'll again give a plug to this. You know, I've definitely been recommending if you typically don't read YA, or if you think, oh, well, I'm really going to need to read the YA, these YA books are amazing. And I know I saw this on Star Wars Explained, their channel. They really talked about with this book, like Phase One, you could maybe have skipped the YA novels and not been lost with the main plot. This book revealed so many plot points. I'm thinking you're going to be somewhat confused or lost when you get to the adult novel if you didn't read this. I think this is becoming, I think they're making the YA more essential this time, which I think is somewhat a good thing. Getting more people to read this awesome work is, I think, the smart decision to make.
I think in Phase One, with Out of the Shadows, the second of the YA novels, I think that's one that I would find pretty indispensable because of, is it Maria? Is that her name? The woman that is attached, that does the paths.
Yes.
Her name, whatever. The really old woman that
Yeah.
Markion Rowe is keeping alive. There is so much really interesting and important information about her in that for me that one is indispensable. But Kyle, you're right, and I love that they started with a YA.
I do too.
That the very first release of Phase Two is not an adult novel; it's a YA novel. I think that's very telling.
Yeah, I agree with that. I know when I first saw that, I was like, oh, that's an interesting choice. But like I said, I think they did it for a very good reason, and it was kind of an interesting way to kind of get it kickstarted. And you were right. You got the character right, Maria. I actually have a big notebook with all the names from Phase One, probably because I mentioned before we started. It's because I did.
You need to publish that. Oh goodness, look at that.
The only reason I typically don't do that, but when I got selected to be on a High Republic panel at DragonCon, I'm also not that usually. I was like, I'm going to have to write these names down. I'm going to study it like I'm studying for a test in college. Which I'm kind of glad I did, because then later, as I read more books, they'll have the conclusion of Phase One and this one, I would go back and reference my notes from that one. So I don't know, maybe I need to start doing this for Phase Two as well, because again, they throw a lot of characters at you, and they're obviously continuing that into Phase Two so far, which I think is maybe a good kind of segue to that. Did you have a favorite character from this new book?
Oh wow, Nick, you go while I think, because I have several.
I did. It was pretty easy. He's kind of the one, kind of like he reminds me a little bit of Reese Silas, and that's Kevmo, the character on the front. He's just delightful. I enjoy him a lot, and his relationship with Marta, that was very fascinating to me. That was really the heart and soul of this book, and I really enjoyed those two interacting together.
Yeah, Kevmo was my also fave. I think throughout the series, they've done an amazing job writing the Padawans. They
have
all come across as essential characters, not as like just a young sidekick, you know, like sometimes that can be the case, or they're all the exact same character, just with different names and different genders. Each one's very different and
unique.
And like they all have different strengths and weaknesses and stuff like that. And I think they really continue that. Like he was easily my favorite character. Now, I mean, I don't think there was a character I didn't enjoy, but he was the standout to me in the first one.
Same.
I love Kevmo too. And Kyle, you're right. I loved the Padawans in High Republic are just really, really well drawn and just beautifully written. But I really like Yana Rowe. I like that she is a little bit of an outsider within this group. What is it called? The Path of the Open.
Path of the Open Hand. Yep.
And so I really liked how she is sort of a bridge between that very enclosed world and the outside world. And I love the way that she protects Marta Rowe. I found her very, very interesting. And I'm sort of very curious, that last name, if you know anything about Phase One, that last name is I'm sort of scratching my head thinking, so how are they related? And so I'm very intrigued about that as well. But Yana and Kevmo were my two.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I really enjoyed about that character is when the first starts off, she's coming across like, oh, she's going to be the villain of this book, and as you go along, you go like, oh, maybe she has a point, and the one we thought was the good person, maybe she's not has the right viewpoint, you know. So, and I think it kind of like both characters, both the Rose sisters, had some good things about them, but they also had some bad, personality traits, and which is what people are. You know, not everybody has universally positive traits. There's all negatives and positives. So I thought that was really well written.
And Marta, in many ways, is very much a Star Wars character, that sort of innocent person in the world with a very, very strong set of beliefs, and then the world explodes, and then she has to deal with all of that. And I'm really curious about how that moves on in the story.
Yeah, and the thing that I think I enjoyed a lot about, like those sister characters and the other characters within the Path of the Open Hand, that this is a Star Wars cult. This is a Force cult. And I know when I was in college, I had to take a few classes where we studied some cults and stuff like that. And I think they did an amazing job here showing like, this is what a cult's like. Not everybody in a cult is bad. Some are actually good and have got hoodwinked. Some of the leadership is good. Some of the leadership is bad and clearly just taking advantage of people. And I think you really saw all the dynamics of a cult, and also how a cult can take somebody that initially has good intentions and warp them into like, maybe they're going to come out the other end not so good anymore. And I thought they did an amazing job. And to me, that was kind of an interesting topic to kind of tackle again in a YA book. You typically don't say like, hey, this is the dynamic of a cult, and again, not everybody's good, not everybody's bad in it. There's a little bit of all of it. And that's kind of a pretty adult topic to kind of deal with in a YA thing. Because usually when I've read a lot of YA books, and a lot of times if there's a cult, it's like, oh, everybody's bad and they want to kill you or brainwash you, and there's no good people in it. They're all bad. So the fact they gave you like, oh no, there's some good people. Just because you're in a cult doesn't necessarily mean you're an evil person. You just fell in with the wrong crowd. Maybe initially they had good intentions, but to me it was very interesting how they explored that group in the book.
I think one thing they did really well in this book with Kevmo and Marta is they had a very mature relationship where they're two different people who have two different belief systems and views. But instead of like trying to convince the other person of coming to their side, they kind of respect each other, tried to learn from each other. And I think that's a really good message in a young adult book. Like, there are going to be times in life where we run into people we don't agree with, or we see the world differently. But instead of trying to flip them to your side, you learn to coexist. And I think both of them did an excellent job of that.
And Marta, I love the way she is shocked by the Padawan using the Force, which is a very cult thing. This sort of idea, sort of like, these are the rules of the world. You are breaking the rules of the world. And I love that. I thought that was really quite wonderful. Something that I found very interesting about the Path of the Open Hand is that what I'm loving about the Phase 2 so far is this sort of diverse ways of people relating to the Force. And in most of Star Wars is the dark side and the light side, with a few smatterings of other things. But I'm really intrigued here how Star Wars is allowing the Force to be read in different ways. And I'm really curious to see what's going to happen with that in the comics. There is this sort of there's like a little introduction to this convention that is going to be happening in Jeddah about all of these different ways of looking at the Force. I'm like, it just looks like this ecumenical medieval convention that's going to happen. It all sounds really, really interesting. But I love that the Path of the Open Hand is another way, a very different way. I would say an opposite way of looking at the Force from the way the Jedi think about it.
Well, yeah, I mean that's something I've really enjoyed about the High Republic series in general is, now we're getting this other group, but like, the phase one and this continuing phase two is like all the Jedi see the Force in very distinct manners. Some relate to it as machinery, some relate to it as waves, some relate to it as light. And clearly at this time in the Jedi's history, they're much more open to people experiencing the Force in different ways.
Mhm.
Whereas when we come to the movies and stuff, it's clearly more like, no, there's one way to do it, and
Right.
again,
Yoda's way.
exactly, and they're also open to more things, and again, this kind of deals with Kevmo and Marta that they're having a little bit of a flirty relationship, and in phase one that was a big thing that as we joked at DragonCon, there was probably more uh, Jedi on Jedi romantic relationships in the High Republic series than the entire history of Star Wars combined. Is like hey, some reason this
True.
phase they did it initially. It still wasn't allowed, but they kind of like you need to experience that side of life as well. And
Mhm.
obviously, by the time Anakin comes around, that has changed. And like a lot of this came up with a lot of people. It's like, hey, if the Jedi in that time period had a more open idea about like Jedi's can have relationships with people, would Anakin went the way he would have instead of being like, no, you're not allowed to like anybody, no attachments, that's it,
Right.
Right, right, right.
I think Carmelo, you brought up an interesting point a minute ago when you talked about Marta and how she experiences the Force. And when we see the Force displayed in the movies or the animated shows, it's always like this big magical like scene, and it's uplifting. But in this book, it's like, and if you're looking at it from her point of view, it's terrifying. And I've never really been terrified of the Force. And there's some points in this book where I kind of empathized with Marta a little bit because she doesn't know obviously what we know or what the Jedi know. So it's just very interesting how they kind of flipped that on us and made the Force a little suspicious.
Yeah, I think, and I love the way the path of the open hand is relating to the Force through fear.
Mhm.
That it is very much about the Force is there, the Force is wonderful, the Force is life. You don't touch the Force. You don't use the Force. And I find it very, very fundamentalist of them.
No.
It has that sort
Yeah.
of evangelical Old Testament way of sort of thinking of that sort of religious power of God or religious power of the Force is something that we do not handle, we do not touch. And so the Jedi are in a way heretics who are using the Force as a weapon. That they keep using in the novel this whole the Jedi use the Force as a weapon, which is a really militaristic way. 200 years before Phantom Menace,
Yeah.
when they're not really using the Force that way, but the path of the open hand is thinking of it that way. So I love the disconnect between those two thoughts.
I was gonna say the other thing I really enjoyed about this again, you got this some in phase one, but I think phase two you're going to get more. I like this idea that this is kind of like a frontier period in Star Wars where they're going to new planets and stuff like that. That was always one of the things that somewhat has always got on my nerves with Star Wars. It's like they never stumble across a planet that doesn't have access to space travel or doesn't seem to be connected in some way. So you kind of lose that to like Star Trek explorers where they're making first contact. There's not a whole lot of first contact in Star
True,
Wars.
true.
Even if maybe the government hasn't touched them, that group still has spaceships, kind of like the Chiss and Thrawn. They just haven't connected yet.
Mhm.
Right.
So this idea that this is somewhat like like the American West or something like that, where like you're going out there and establishing new frontier towns, and you're going to planets that the Jedi don't know a whole lot about and stuff like that.
Yeah,
I'm really enjoying that aspect of the story so far.
and the little the scroll that they have at the beginning, it says it is a time of great exploration. So we're set in a time where we're sort of figuring out the boundaries and the worlds in the world, and that's really exciting. And you're right, that's a very Star Trek thing, not a
Yeah.
very Star Wars thing. So it's fun that we're getting a little bit of that here.
And I don't know if either of y'all have read the middle school novel yet that just came out, Quest for the Hidden City, but it leans into that even more. That
Yes.
this is more like very much like, oh, these are like people, blazing a trail and establishing a new town and stuff like that, or figuring out a way to cross the Rocky Mountains or something like that in our period.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to see Star Wars kind of delve into this thing that they've really never talked about before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this
Well,
whole phenomenon of the Pathfinder, I find
yes.
really intriguing. We know very little yet, but it just sounds really, really interesting. And it almost sounds, what was his name? Lord Santeca?
Yep.
Yeah,
The
from the Force
Santecas,
Awakens.
they
Yeah.
seem to be sort of like, they seem to be sort of connected to it, or they will be the descendants
Yep.
many years later. I'm sort of curious how all these lines are gonna
Yeah.
cross.
Cross. Yeah.
Yeah. Really fun. It's really fun.
Well, I enjoy the not just the kind of frontier exploration, but I kind of enjoyed that hyperspace is still a little sketchy. Communication's not reliable, so that makes for interesting story, decisions that can be made in the future. So I'm curious to see how much further they go into it, because this is only 350 years before the films,
Yeah.
and at that point everything seems established, set up.
Yeah.
There's no concerns.
Right.
But 350 years is a long time, and you just look at our world and how different it was 350 years ago.
Yeah.
So I'm curious. I'm kind of glad Star Wars is doing a little different, because Kyle, I don't, you're probably a little closer in age than me and Carmelo, but the KOTOR games, the Knights of the Old Republic, those games were set thousands of years, but they were basically the same as the films. They were not much different. So I enjoy Star Wars kind of being a little different with their time period there.
If you think about it, in our world, 150 years ago, there were no cars, there were no highways.
Right.
Oh yeah. It's always a
No
That's
planes.
150 years ago. And so
Yeah.
it's really interesting to sort of move back and sort of see that. Kyle, I have a question for you, because
Yeah.
you have read everything.
Try to.
Legends,
Yeah.
are there sort of originary moments of hyperlanes, of hyperspace lanes? Is there any discussion about that?
Not that I'm aware of. Not really. It's just one of those things that's always kind of happen, and even like in a lot of the stuff, they're kind of vague about, like, this one it seems like they're more establishing, like there's these established almost like highways that everybody's getting
Yeah.
into.
Yeah.
Where like if you're just watching the movies and something, it's almost feels like, no, the computer's just calculating you're currently here. How do you get there? And it's like you just go. It's not really put out there like, oh no, you're getting on this almost like this highway that's going to take you there. Because
Right.
I don't remember ever being any point a book talking about like, oh no, we can't get in hyperspace yet. We need to go another system over before we can kind of catch the next point. So it's
Right.
definitely looking at hyperspace in a different way. And I don't know if at some point maybe it'll be in phase 3, there'll be some sort of hyperspace breakthrough that kind of takes us to like, all right, now this is how we understand hyperspace now. But it's never been talked about a whole lot. It's
Okay.
just one of those things like it just existed, and you just were supposed to accept it existed and not talk too much about it, not ask like how does it work, or what's the machine in each ship that makes it work. But even in phase 1 they even allude to like there's some elements of the force involved, and I'm kind of interested in see how that plays out. But
Well,
unless I missed something, to my
I was
knowledge,
just
it's never really been talked about. Yeah.
I was going to say that I think when Lucas was developing Star Wars, the original trilogy, he just created that as a way just to an easy cheat to get to a planet that are thousands of miles away. He didn't really care about the science behind it. And I assume back in the day when they were doing the expanded universe, they didn't really care either. They're just kind of, it's an easy plot point to get a character from one place to another.
Right. I was just curious because phase 2 seems to be very much about finding those lanes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very much so.
Which I find really exciting because it's sort of, that's the way you connect the galaxy, by being able to use hyperspace lanes to move. So I was just curious, see if there was something else or not. So
yeah.
Again, I think it's kind of going back. I think it's kind of going back to this being a frontier era of Star Wars. That it's kind of going like all this new technology is coming about, and stuff like that, and kind of making debuts, and kind of, it again talking about like how communication hasn't really been. They're kind of perfecting that, so it's kind of like their version of the Pony Express, or all these like satellites being set up and stuff like that. They haven't perfected, how they, rest of Star Wars, it just talk really easy and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting to see how that's going so far. So yeah. Were there anything in general else you wanted to talk about before we get into some plot spoilers?
I don't think so for me.
Oh, what I have are sort of more specific block points. So
Okay. So if you haven't read this book yet,
run away.
one, read it, but yeah, go away because we're going to start definitely spoiling some plot points at the moment. And definitely there are some big surprises in this book that, I think I definitely recommend going into this book not knowing these surprises. I think you'll take away from the enjoyment of like, I've I've watched a few reviews on YouTube, and a lot of people have been very consistent with a lot of people were surprised with where the book went. They were, as you guess along, this is how I think the story is going to end in this book. And almost everybody agreed, like, oh no, we were all wrong. We did not see them ending it how they did, which again, I think goes back to phase one. They did an amazing job of always like, taking the story in ways you weren't expecting or killing characters you weren't expecting them to and stuff like that. And they continue this in phase two. So I'll assume if you're at this point, you don't care about spoilers or if you've read the book. So let's get into talking about the plot and more general point. So I mean, I think a good point, sorry, is probably is jump straight to the end. How surprised were you that basically again, our favorite character and then his mentor, like you're kind of assuming like I was assuming reading this first book, Kev Mo is going to be this phase's version of a Bell, the young Padawan Jedi that we were kind of going to follow along and kind of see him grow up. And I think they might have done that on purpose. Like, oh, everybody loved Bell in phase one. Here's our Bell. And then you get to it and you're like, oh, this is not our, because basically at the end of this book, all the characters you've read about on the Jedi side are now just gone. It's like, well, who's the adult novel going to be about now? Like, what's going on?
I was not ready for it. I mean, when I finished this novel, I went online and I put, I was not ready for this book. You are not ready for this book.
Yeah.
Because the last 50, 60 pages of this novel is not what I expect from YA. It's not really what I expect from Star Wars.
No.
But it was still like emotional and moving and powerful and devastating. Because it's really interesting. The first, maybe like the first 70 pages of the novel, we're setting up, and we're starting a new phase. So there's a lot of information that they need to give us, and so it's sort of quote unquote slow because there's a lot of exposition.
Yeah.
But the second half of the novel, when it starts moving, this thing doesn't stop. I read this in 2.5 days, and I have a full-time job. Because I could not stop. But that ending was devastating to me. Just completely devastating to me.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. When I was reading, I first like, oh, they're doing a lot of world building with this YA book. So, maybe this one's going to be a little bit more involved in the plot because, the first YA books, they would do some world building, but it's mainly exploring these characters and kind of doing, that element. And it's like, oh, this is kind of really establishing a lot of stuff. It's just off to, kind of a slow start if you don't enjoy world building and stuff like that. But like, yeah, once I would say probably halfway through the book is when the flood happens. After the flood, things move at a breakneck pace and it's really nonstop and it's keeping you on your toes. What is happening here? There's clearly something going on in this cult. What's going on with this cult? Who knows what the cults, which cult members know what's going on and which don't, and who's going to buy into it and who's not going, because there's points, and I forgot his name and I didn't write him down, but you have the second ranking member of the cult that you seem to think is maybe a good cult member, and then suddenly when you get towards the end, you're like, oh no, he's not a good guy.
He just course father.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I can't remember his name, but he's not good. He wants to be in charge of the cult. That's the only thing that's different about him. He wants to have his own version of the evil cult, not Mother's version of the evil cult. And now you have Marta now being like, oh nope, I now want to be in charge of the cult and I want to take it the way I want to go. It's I was not expecting a cult power struggle to break out and not really have a good character anymore, except the character that we assumed was going to be the bad cult member turned out to be the only sane member of the cult, it seems like.
Right. Like you guys have said, this took some turns that I wasn't expecting. I think High Republic in general have just done a really good job of that. It's just like there's characters that you don't expect to go, characters you fall in love with, don't get too attached because they will be gone. One character we haven't really mentioned yet, that was the girlfriend of Yana Kor. her death
Yep.
was very shocking to me. And then to learn what happened and how she passed, and it was a setup. That was not expecting that to happen. And I was just kind of taken away because that was a really good relationship. That's another relationship in this book that I really enjoyed reading about.
Yeah, that scene where they're supposed to be, you know, freeing an artifact
Yeah,
from
yeah.
that place, and it's totally undermined, and that was just really scary. Like actively, oh, it was just really disturbing. Really,
Well,
really.
even
Yes.
how that happened, that their kind of heist crew, the entire time there was one member of the heist crew that was a little skis, and you assume like, oh, something's going to happen, and this guy's going to turn on him, and then that's not what happens.
Right.
And you're like, oh no,
Yes.
he got screwed too, and then you get back and like, oh, even though he was kind of a skeezy guy, he had somebody that loved him when they get back, and now that
Yep.
person's upset, and so it's like they purposely were kind of like giving you these characters like, oh, this is going to be the person that's going to do something,
Yes.
and it ends up like, nope, hey, we just fooled you. While we made you look over here, it actually happened over here.
Yes.
And so much, I think, as somebody who reads a lot of YA, that's something like YA a lot of times is really bad at is they're very easily, forecast what they're going to do. And you're easily go like, all right, this is going to be the bad person. This is the good person. At some point, they're going to intersect, but it's how you do it. But this one is not the case. You have no idea what's going to happen until you finish it. You're like, oh, that's not what I was expecting. Because
No.
I assumed, of course, reading it, either that the mother character was either going to die or that her and Marta were going to become like, clearly almost, master disciple type of thing. And that's not the case.
Mm.
Mother makes it through, but now Mother and Marta are now kind of rivals for power and stuff like that, and you really weren't expecting that, and it's
Yeah, the
interesting.
mother, the mother scared the crap out of me the moment she showed up in the first.
It's very terrifying.
She
Yes,
was just so disturbing. Like I know people like that.
yes,
And it's just sort of like there is something wrong here. There's something very wrong here. Like when that jewel that ends up being something else later in the
yeah.
novel, the way that she looks at that thing, it was sort of like just really, really disturbing. Really disturbing. We can talk about the ending of the book, right, Kyle?
Yeah. Feel free.
Okay.
Yeah,
I love the fact that, you know, Yana and Marta are sort of like in the same group with them at the end, but there is like all this like potential insurrection that is going to be happening. And so the novel actually doesn't end with a resolution.
no,
The novel actually ends with the conflict, with the tension that I guess we're going to have in phase two. And so I found it very unlike many young adult novels where there is some sort of a wrap up. This was very much about sort of like setting it up. And I love that. I love that very, very much because I kept reading the novel, like you were saying, like they give you all these hints so you think this is the way. And so I kept not being able to guess, but I definitely was not guessing that it was going to end up as in we're all in the same ship now. The gaze electric, which
electric.
is
Yeah,
screen
yeah,
on page 9.
yeah.
Um, and so it's really interesting that they're still a group, they're still the path of the open hand, but there is a war going on within the group itself, and I love that. That was really fun.
I mean, of course, it's heavily implied, and I think we're all safe in guessing that at some point the path of the open hand becomes denial or becomes the
Right.
ideological inspiration behind the philosophy of the Nile. And it's kind of figuring out like, all right, we have two Rose sisters, and we know the Rose are still in charge of the Nile all these, centuries later. But it's like now you're kind of guessing like, well, which sister is actually the one that? Because at this point you can like, it could be either one. So I
It
mean,
could be
it
either
was a
one.
brilliant thing. Instead of them giving you a character, go like, oh, this is clearly the one that's going through. They're going like, no, which one is it? You don't know. And it's to me that's a fascinating decision that they're kind of keeping you guessing right away. They didn't really give you a whole lot of info yet. You thought you were getting a lot of info, and then it's like, no, not so much. I mean, I honestly thought the entire time that like the Marta's sister was going to die at some point. That was what's going to ascend her towards her evil path. And like, no, that
Oh,
didn't happen. I thought at some point like there'd be some sort of conflict, and maybe the Jedi would catch the team or something like that, and she would die trying to steal something or protect what they had stolen, and that never happened. And like you go like, oh, it was amazing how they kind of again kept you off guard the entire time.
And it's interesting. I thought the other way around. I thought Marta was going to die,
Oh, did you?
and then Yana, as revenge,
Yeah.
was going to find a way to do something, whatever it is that she was going to do. It was interesting that we had like opposite
views. Yeah.
theories.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you guys remember the Eye of the Storm comics that Marvel did? So those comics, I want to go back and reread them because they do a lot of the Everini, the species that Marta, Yana, and Martiana are
Right.
from. I would very be interested to see. I haven't read them in a while. I'd like to see if there's anything I can pick up on, but I'm very interested with those people because as far as I know, I don't know if they're the only two survivors or where the rest of their people are, but and Markion's is kind of holding a centuries long grudge from his ancestors. So I mean, obviously something happens. Not maybe it's more than just this. Something else is going to happen to make that grudge even stronger and fester into what we see in phase one.
And talking about comics, I had just finished rereading all of the High Republic comics when I read this, and when Dalna shows up in here, I was like, wait a minute. There's a moment in Trail of Shadows, I don't know who it was, that says some information about Planet Dalna has been deleted from the
Deleted.
Jedi.
Yeah.
Oh, I missed that.
And
Yep.
I only remember it because it was fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
And I opened this book and we're in Dalna, and I'm like, why does that ring a bell? So it's really interesting that something's going to happen in this planet.
Right.
150 years later, it's going to be deleted from the Jedi archive. So I'm just like, I just can't wait. I can't.
Yeah.
Well, and I think was it Midnight Horizon when Yoda, I guess we're in spoilers for that too, but
Yeah.
Yoda says we have to look to the past to kind of fix today's mistakes.
Oh yeah.
So obviously, I think the Jedi, while they are heroes to the audience, I think they do something that's probably unforgivable to these people. So I'm curious to see what could the Jedi do that's so bad to make these people wage war against the whole galaxy.
Do you guys
Exactly.
know if I'm so sorry. Do you guys know if the new Yoda comics is a High Republic story or not?
That I don't know.
Okay. I think the first set of it's supposed to be 10 issues, and I think the first story, which is about 3 issues, will be High Republic era.
Okay.
And then it'll go to like different points in his life, kind of like the Obi-Wan comic did.
Oh, sorry to interrupt.
No,
well, I mean, and that's actually one thing I was going to mention that was kind of, they brought up, again, Yoda was kind of mentioned in phase one a lot. He only showed up, once in the books. And then, at the time in phase one, he's alluded to like clearly as the top Jedi. And then you go back 200 years and he's still alluded to as the top Jedi. So now you're like, well, how long has Yoda been in charge for?
Too
that
long.
went through all this stuff,
Little
but like this is
maybe
maybe he needed term limits at this point.
Yeah.
The one I'll kind of go on that point too, like the one character I think that I was hoping, I was actually kind of surprised we didn't see him early on in the first couple of books that came out, was in phase one of my favorite characters was Porter Engle, which was the really old cook that was like the grizzled war veteran that almost seemed too much by the time phase one came along.
Yeah.
So I was kind of interested to see. I know he is supposed to be in phase two, so I was kind of a little disappointed he did appear immediately. I'm sure he'll show up eventually, but I love that character so much. That's probably one of the things I was most excited about phase two. Is like, oh, I want to see Porter Engle. Is one fascinating when we did the Dragon Con High Republic series, which was only halfway through the phase, and all the men on the panel at that point, Porter Engle was their favorite character. It was very interesting. Like four different people said like Porter.
He's memorable.
He's a very memorable character. And again, we've never really seen a Jedi like him before, which I think throughout the series, we're constantly seeing all these Jedi we've never seen before. It's been, very, very interesting. Were there any other elements of the story that you really enjoyed a lot that we haven't touched on yet? I kind of want to do that before if we touch on any things we didn't enjoy.
I there wasn't very much of it, but I really enjoy this Sunshine Dobbs.
Yep.
Yeah.
And his infatuation with the mother. Like, I don't know if he's bewitched, in love, has a crush. Like it's never clear what's
Yeah, they
going
kind of
on.
skip over that, so you don't know if it's like, oh, is she just that charismatic?
Is
Or
he
Right.
working for her
did
or something?
he have some sort of artifact? Because he seems like he is like beyond obsessed, more than the other cult members are. So like, does
Yes.
she have some sort of artifact that she used? Because again, they skipped over that part. So I'm assuming that's something we'll get in later books. Unless I missed anything in the middle school book, he's not in it, but he's actually referenced in the middle school book. So he's
Right.
the only person that's so far been in both books of the first phase two books. So yeah, I kind of enjoyed him. He's a kind of interesting,
Yeah.
kind
He
of a
was.
skis ball top character.
Yeah.
Yes. And he shows up
Sunshine.
very briefly in
In the
the very
comics.
first issue of the comics.
Yes.
It's like a parallel story at the end of the first issue, and he shows up towards the end. But I'm just sort of curious. He's like a really cheesy salesman,
Yeah.
but at
Well,
the
to me,
same time, but at the same time, this obsession with the mother,
yeah.
like
It's a little
want to
odd.
know more.
Well,
Like
I
what's
even liked his
going on
name a
here?
lot because to me, again, I referenced the American West a lot. To me, that even sounds like a cowboy name, like Sunshine Dobbs. It just kind of comes across as like,
Yeah.
oh, come
Sunshine
on, Billy,
Dogs.
what is your real first name? And why did you pick Sunshine as your replacement name and stuff like that? And it very much, yeah, just like I said, comes across as like a scam artist. But at the
Yeah,
same time,
yeah.
um, you know, uh, obviously, he does some bad things in this book, and you don't know, like, well, did he do this type of evil stuff before he met the mother, or did she just kind of send him on this path of being a psychopath at this point,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
willing to kill anybody that she orders? But he was an
Oh,
interesting
you might.
character.
Yeah, we'll see.
I enjoyed the kind of the small scale of this story. We kind of stayed on one planet. As much as I love the Light of the Jedi, and it kind of was bouncing around and a lot going on. It's fast paced. This book, I enjoyed the small character moments we got to visit with them and kind of learn about them. And I think that makes the ending of the book even more heartbreaking because we spent so much time getting
Yeah.
to know them. But and the end kind of it's going to leave some big implications, I assume, for the next set of books and comics that are coming up. But the Path of the Open Hand is very fascinating to me, and they're a new kind of villain that I've really enjoyed, and I think I kind of enjoy Star Wars diversifying their villains a little bit.
I love the hormones.
Yeah.
Marta and Kevmo. I was like slightly turning red, sort of like, how far
Yeah.
are they going on this? Um,
Well, that
and,
happened a lot in phase one. There was a lot of times I was like, oh, it's not more like, oh, they're implying there's an attraction. Like, no, they're going it right and saying, like, no, there's an attraction. And then,
Right.
certain phases they allude to, like, oh, certain things happened in that bedroom and only people know. And like, oh, wow,
right.
they're just flat out saying, like, oh, we're giving you some rated
It,
R Star Wars content,
yeah, yeah. But it
Yes.
was fun seeing this sort of like this desire
Yeah.
between the two of them. That was really like very 13-year-old, 14-year-old kind of behavior, which I really enjoyed because we don't get that. We usually
Yeah.
get the romance. We usually get the romance, but not the hormones. And it was fun
Right.
seeing the hormones.
What it kind of reminded me of a little bit, because both these individuals obviously grew up in very close knit communities and very sheltered. One in Jedi, one in Path of the Open Hand. Is to
Yeah,
me like maybe two teenagers growing up in small towns, and they go away to like a camp during the summer, and it's their first time away from parents. And they're like, oh,
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
oh,
you got it. You got it.
who's this boy? I've never met somebody from outside my small town, and like, oh, who's this girl? And they're like a
Yeah.
quick little summer
Summer
romance
fling.
there that
Yeah.
kind of pops up and go like, and just because they're different, they're like, oh, this is the most interesting person in the world, now. And
Hmm.
Totally. I like the summer camp
That's a very good
analogy.
comparison. Yes.
I'll touch on, and it's not really a complaint, but one thing I did enjoy, and goes a little bit to like actually what you saying, Nick, that you enjoyed, was that it was just on one planet. And I kind of mainly just because it was the first book in the phase, I kind of wanted to know a little bit more about what the state of the universe is at this point. And you don't really get it. It's very confined to this one planet and a couple frontier planets. So you don't really know what's going on Coruscant, how's what's going on with the public. It's other than them alluding to this war between these two planets, which if from phase one at that point, that war is over. So they're kind of, I'm assuming that war is going to come up again more throughout phase two. But you didn't really get a whole lot of info about just what else is going on. It's very confined to the story, which I do agree. I think it does make you feel more connected to those to those characters, I should say, and the ending more impactful. But I was just very curious going into phase two. Like, all right, what's the Jedi up to? What's the Republic up to? I'm assuming we're going to get a lot of that in the first adult novel, which comes out in literally a couple of days. But that was my only complaint. And it was mainly, I don't think I would have complained about as much if it had been the first book of the phase. And again, I don't think it really hurt the plot of the story. It's just more like, I'm just curious. I just want the answers. And I didn't want to have to wait another month to get those answers, being an anxious Star Wars fan. And that's one thing I enjoyed so much about a lot of the Jedi when it started off, is like how much they jumped around. To me, like they did a masterful job of making it, because a lot of times when you have something like this all world building, it can become boring, but they did a great job of like introducing you to the Star Wars galaxy at the time, but at the same time giving you an amazing plot, which is very, very hard to do. But so I understand why they did it, but I wouldn't mind like maybe a couple radio messages back to Coruscant or something like that, saying like, "Hey, what's going on?" Or because at this point we don't know who we don't know who the Chancellor is. Right. We don't really know much about the Jedi other than that Yoda's still around.
We don't really know the council, who's on the council at this point.
We don't even know why this war is happening. They just allude to this forever war, but we don't know why it's happening. Is there any other groups that the Republic is up against at the moment? We really know nothing at this point. We just know like, oh, we're 200 years before, and I guess the only thing we know is like they're figuring out hyperspace, and that's basically it.
Exploring the galaxy.
You impatient man.
I'm very impatient.
I think that's happening, but I'm sort of with Nick with this one. I love that it was a local story because it feels like a prologue. It feels like it's giving us all of the little kernels that then they're going to develop into whatever it is that happens in phase two. There's that war, the forever war that is happening. And there's Jeddah. And so there are all of these things that are sort of like floating about. So it feels like a prologue. It feels like, the little book that sort of sets it up.
Well, I very much in phase one, I kind of developed the feeling that, they kind of paired that, there's a book for each age group and each kind of like mini phase within the phase. And I always felt like you really couldn't judge all the books until you kind of read until you read the adult, young adult, middle school, anything comics go along with it. And then you're like, all right, this is how I felt about it. Because, occasionally there was, like a YA book, like, oh, like, I'm not sure. And then you'd read the next book. You're like, all right, now I understand more what happened in that book and why it was important that they did it that way. So to me, like, I think that part of the book it's what I did enjoy. It's just like, oh, I just wish I would have done that stuff. Once you get the adult novel and you kind of view it as like, oh, this is all companion pieces, that complaint probably goes away. I'm assuming the first adult novel is going to be more of a wider scope
larger
story. Because again, we're going into the first adult novel and we really don't know who our Jedi main characters are going to be. We really don't have any Jedi at this point that we think of, these are the people we're going to be following along for phase two.
Yoda.
Yoda. And we know, like I said, I think they have
Porter's
going to be there at some point.
Yeah.
But we don't know, is he more of, again, a secondary Jedi character, or is he going to be a main Jedi? Because, phase one, even though everybody loved him, he wasn't a main character. He was just like a secondary guy,
Yeah.
I'm curious.
Do I remember correctly that the first set of the first phase were released at the same time? The Light of the Jedi, Into the Dark, were they published on the released on the same day?
I honestly don't know, because since I wasn't super excited to read the series, I think I didn't get the lot of the Jedi until it had already been out for 2 or 3 weeks. I was like, all right, it's been out. I guess I have a chance to go by. And I think by the time I got it, all the other first books had came out.
Okay.
And then after that, now I pretty much go to the bookstore the day they come out and get them. So it would have surprised me if they did release them all the same day. I don't know.
I don't remember, but I sort of feel like they were not spaced out.
No, I think there was a couple of times where like uh adult novel would come out and so would the middle grade book would kind of come out the same day. I think that
Yeah.
happened with like Rising Storm and Race to Crash Point Tower and a couple others that I think that's what happened. And they would
Yeah.
release like the first issue and then the book come out the same day and then the issue would take after the book. So it kind of got a little
Right.
fuzzy
Right.
So
there.
probably my biggest complaint about the High Republic series is my local bookstore cannot figure out where to put the books at because the adult novels they do have a Star Wars book section, but they only put the adult novels in the Star Wars book section. So
Same
like when
thing
I
here.
showed up to
Oh,
get this one, I first went to the new release table. It wasn't there. I went to the Star Wars section. It wasn't there. I looked back and looked all the sections twice. It's like it's not here. And I went to the front desk. It's like, oh, that's in our YA table.
Yep.
And it's like the only Star Wars book on the entire table. But I was like, no, this book goes with this other ones. And the same with
right.
the middle school book. I had to go find the middle school set, and they just had it randomly jammed in the shelf somewhere.
Oh
So it's
goodness.
always a
We had the
venture to
same
try to
issue
find
here
a
in
book. Yeah,
Chicago.
yeah.
Oh
Yeah, we have the
wow.
same here. Like Barnes and Noble does it that way. I have a local bookstore in my town. They do it exactly the same way. I have to go to different sections of the bookstore to get the books because they don't have them in the same place.
It's
Like even
a
the YA and the middle grader are in different sections.
oh, they're different. Yeah, yeah. Same
Yeah.
way mine. I will say, luckily, my bookstore does have a Star Wars section. There was a brief period about 5 or 6. I always assumed they had a new manager, but they decided like, why do we have a Star Wars section? It's just sci-fi, and they just mixed them up into the sci-fi section
Oh
by
goodness.
author last name. Which it was a nightmare because a lot of times with the old expanded universe, they didn't really make a big deal about who the author was. It's like, oh, the next book's coming out, and you just would show up, and then you'd have to like, well, I don't even know who wrote the book. It's just the next book, and then you'd have to try to find it in
Oh
50
no.
bookshelves. So like, what's the last name? What's the last name?
Oh
It was a nightmare.
goodness. Goodness.
Well, is there anything else on Path of Deceit that y'all would like to touch on before we wrap up the discussion on the book? And I guess maybe this is also a good time to, what are you most excited about for the adult novel? Do you think Marta and like the Path of the Open Hand will be in the adult novel, or will focus on something else, and maybe those storylines will interconnect at a later date? Any predict? I know obviously at the beginning of the phase, it's very, very hard to predict what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Especially after this book. This book told us we're not going to be able to predict anything.
No, no. I'm
I am really looking forward for how Jeddah plays out.
Yep.
This there are lots of references to Jeddah in here, and Marta is very interested in to take the path of the open hand there and all of that. It happens in the comics, and so I'm really curious to see sort of the role of that planet and that city in the world of the High Republic. That is probably the thing I am most excited about.
Yeah, I think if I had to make a prediction, it would either be that Jeddah will be in it, or we'll go and see more about this forever war that's taking place, because both the middle school and the young allude to it, and the fact that there's a lot of Jedi kind of involved in trying to bring it to a peaceful conclusion. So I'm wondering if the adult novel will kind of be set there, or maybe in Jeddah or something like that. It has a feeling though like this phase two is very much focusing on the frontier. So I'm wondering if the adult novel will be set somewhere on the frontier. It doesn't really feel like we're going to be on Coruscant a lot, at least for the first couple books. So
I think you're right. I think you're right. I'm wondering at the end of the middle grader, the Forever War ends. Isn't that correct?
well, I think
You have it
right
closer
behind
to
me.
you than me. I think at the very end they say the war is over. So
Yeah, I
I'm
think
wondering,
they do allude to it. Yeah,
and so I'm wondering if the adult novel is the war
yeah,
and the
That's interesting.
resolution of the war.
How it ended exactly.
Carmelo never
yeah,
speculates, but I just speculated. We'll see what
yeah. It
happens.
does. Yeah, right. Because at the end they are having that celebration, and then they say
Right,
like, "Oh, a new celebration just started. We just heard the war is over and stuff." And
right. So
I mean that I'll
maybe
do
it's
that
about the
later.
war. Maybe
Could
it's
be
about the war.
because I mean that's the one thing in phase one that sometimes would get confusing is sometimes the books were set in different times. Other times it's clear, oh, these stories are happening at the exact same time, and sometimes it
Right.
takes you a little bit to figure out what's the timing on this. So that could be a good point. Maybe we are going to learn how the war ends, and maybe that's establishing our Jedi heroes who are the ones who successfully brought the war to a conclusion. I'm not sure.
We'll find out very soon.
Yeah.
Very soon. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think from what I have not really read anything about Convergence, the next novel. I don't know anything really about it. I'm still actually reading the middle grade one. But I think I was a podcast I listened to called Star Wars Splash Page, and they review comics. They had did the episode last week when issue 2 of the High Republic came out. They had mentioned that it's a 10 issue series, the comics, and it all takes place on Jeddah. So I wonder if Jeddah is going to be strictly the comics and audio drama, and then maybe we'll
Could be.
see,
That's
because
right, because there's an audio drama
Battle of
called
Jeddah.
Battle of Jeddah. So
Yeah.
Could be.
So
Yeah, I know
I'm curious
one
to see where
thing
that plays out.
similar to like you, after phase one, I mean, after a few books, when I realized like how much major plot points would happen in books, characters would die, all these surprises. I purposely avoided all review. I'd even want to, the only thing I would know about the next book is like, what is it going to be called? And that would be it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't look up any other info because I like at this point, like so much is going to happen each book. I don't want even to remotely, I don't even look at reviews to see if like people said like, oh, I liked it or I didn't like it. Cause I'm afraid so like, oh, I didn't like it because of
Such and
something
such. Yeah.
upsetting happened,
Yeah.
So I really like, all right, when's the next book and when's it coming out? And that's literally all I know about it.
Yep.
I mean, all going into phase two, literally all I knew was it was set a couple hundred years before it, and I'd heard that they were going to have Porter Engle in a book, and that was literally my entire knowledge.
Yeah.
I didn't want to know anything else.
Is The Blade about Porter Engle?
The Blade is a 4 issue comic series that's about him. He takes is it the Blade of Bardada?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, I think
Which,
I don't know if they've announced. I think, and this could have even changed. I think the idea is at some point he's supposed to have like even like a standalone book, kind of just about him. But I'm not sure if that changed as they worked out more of how it was going. But like a year ago, again, something I heard at DragonCon at that time, the idea is like, oh, there's going to be a book just about him.
Okay.
Because I think they realized
cool.
like, oh,
he's
people
popular.
really like this character. Let's explore him a little bit more.
Yeah.
Which great. Was, not to get off topic too much, but I was rewatching the Clone Wars, and I forgot there was 2 episodes where Mace Windu and Jar Jar Binks go to Bardada, and I was like, oh, and then
yep.
I forgot about that, and so I'm curious to see what Bardada looks like during the High Republic and kind of the rest of the familiar planets that we know during the movies.
Porter Engle from Bardada?
They don't really say where he's from. They just say that that's his nickname. He's the Blade of Bardada. So you don't know if that's because if you don't know if he got the name.
Liberated
like,
the
did he do something
or...
from there, or he's from there, and that's how, so it's again I think that's why a lot of people enjoyed him out so much. Like amongst the Jedi, he was clearly like a mythical figure amongst the Jedi. So you're like, oh, if the Jedi think this guy's really cool. And of course, when you get that one, the one scene in the book where he's basically riding a fighter jet through the sky, you're like, oh, this guy is really cool,
Yeah. I'm curious to see where his story goes, and I'm kind of curious, like I said, to see where familiar planets that we know that are in the Republic during the prequels and the original trilogy, kind of what they are like, and I would love to see the first contact or how they join the Republic. That'd be really cool to see.
Indeed,
because we still really haven't, like so far in the books, you still haven't really visited a planet that like has people on it that also didn't have access to space travel yet. They might not have connected with the Republic yet, but they're still, it's not like a Star Wars, ship lands on Earth and you're like, hey, where are y'all from? What's going on here? So I'm kind of hoping in this phase, since it is more of a frontier, that they'll actually land on a planet and you're like, oh, we don't have spaceships yet. Where did y'all come from? We didn't know anybody else was out there. What's going on, with this? And to me, that would be really fascinating to kind of see that element of the story.
I would be curious if they do that or not. It's not a very Star Wars thing to do.
It doesn't, but like I think they've been doing so many things that's not Star Wars.
Yeah.
That I think they've been giving them a lot of freedom to kind of go places that Star Wars, which I think is some of the reason like they've said they wanted to do books this far before the movies. It gave them freedom to really do anything they wanted to because they weren't beholden to anything. Because even if they dramatically changed Star Wars elements, they could say like, "Whoa, that was 150 years ago. That stuff had all went away by the time the movies." It gave them an excuse. So I think the only thing we know is Yoda's not going to die. Unless it turns out he was a clone all along,
And there will be a republic.
Yeah, there will be a republic, and that's really it. There's nothing else. Yeah.
Well, there's a couple other Jedi we know that are in the prequels. Oppo Rensis, He's a Jedi, and I think the prequels he's on the council. He showed up in I think the comics of High Republic, and then Yarel Poof, the really long necked Jedi.
Oh yeah.
I think
Yeah,
he's
there's a couple
referenced
minor things, and there's like one of the Jedi, I can't remember which one now, is one of the Jedi who died in phase one or did something in phase one has a statue in like the temple of like one of the lost Jedi or something like that. So people going in
that's
knew
right
like, oh, something's going to happen to that specific
to one of those
Jedi.
characters.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
Master
but
Sinube should be around too.
yeah,
So
there's
there's
should
some
be some
familiar
here.
faces. I'm excited to see what
Nick,
they're doing during this
Nick,
time.
you're amazing with this kind of detail. I'm just like
I'm not good at it, which is why I don't do the.
completely amazed that you can remember these connections.
Yeah, I don't. I'm not. Again, I'm not that type of detail either.
I'm gonna get a notebook like you, Kyle, with
I
like
have to
all the
keep notes.
names, a
There's a
little
reason.
encyclopedia for myself.
Goodness.
There's a reason I don't do.
This-
And again, my favorite thing at Dragon Con every year is there's a Star Wars trivia contest that's absolutely amazing, and it's basically watching people Jeopardy level players just doing Star Wars stuff. It's amazing. Anytime they do it, you're
It's fun.
happy if you see like out of every 10 questions, if you get one right, you feel smart. And it's absolutely amazing the level of knowledge and stuff like that. It's always because again, they're showing things like on a comic book page and like, all right, this comic book appeared once the ship did, like what's the name of the ship or what's the ship model? And you have to
Oh
spell
my
it right.
God.
You
Yeah.
know, and that
I
type of
can't do
stuff. You know?
ships. I can do
It's absolutely
people.
amazing. Um,
Well, maybe
yeah,
maybe I'll go down to Dragon Con next year. I would love to go.
I would highly recommend it.
Very
And I
fun.
usually tell anybody that's a Star Wars fan, if you go to just one thing, go to the trivia contest.
Okay.
It's like the first year I went, and it was like I always kind of go into like oh yeah, I know a lot about Star Wars, and you go in like oh I don't know anything about this. Is absolutely amazing to know. It's one of those things. Their knowledge is almost like inspiring. You go like I don't understand how this is possible, and apparently I know heard people talk about that. Like people with Lucas have actually acknowledged like the Dragon Con Star Wars trivia contest is actually like the hardest Star Wars trivia contest like anywhere. It's
Wow.
alluded to as like the hardest one.
Oh
In
wow.
fact, I never heard what the reaction was. But in 2020, they did a virtual Dragon Con because of COVID, and they actually did the trivia con. So if you want to see the trivia contest, if you go to Star Wars Explained,
Oh
the
fun.
2020 Dragon Con trivia contest was on their channel. And they
Oh, that's
alluded
cool.
to that people with Lucas were very excited to watch it because they'd always heard about the trivia contest, but they had never got to see it because they
Yeah.
obviously can't go to Dragon Con
Yeah.
just to sit in the crowd and watch the trivia contest.
What
Right.
But
fun.
it is amazing. My favorite thing ever to Star Wars trivia contest at Dragon Con was last year. They would play snippets of audio of an alien language, and the players had to identify what the language was. They didn't have to translate it, but just be like a gerbil. It's like, all right, what language is that? And some were easy because like it'd be like a Wookiee, but
Right.
then other ones it'd be like a random gerbil, and like nobody had no clue. It was again, it was amazing.
That's
funny.
fun. That sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
It's Labor Day weekend, right?
It's always Labor Day weekend,
Over
so
Labor
yep,
Day. Mhm.
yep. So it's always a lot of fun. Again, I always recommend, if you're into cons, it's if you're local. Luckily, I live very close to it, so it's not a big deal for me to go down every year. But if you're into cons, it's one of those things. Go to at least once. If anything, and Nick can probably attest from going this like it's probably the thing it's known best for is the cosplay. So if you're into
Yes.
cosplay, a
Oh,
lot of
yes.
people just go to Dragon Con. Like I'm a panel person. I love going to panels.
Same.
But there's other people I know that go to Dragon Con that literally just go there to walk around and look at the cosplayers. And that's
That's
the
me.
only thing they'll do the entire time. And I'll usually, even though I love panels, I usually always skip at least one or two panel time periods, again, just to walk around and
Visit.
look. And
Yeah.
you'll walk around for an hour and you're like, it didn't feel like an hour because I just saw 500 amazing costumes that I never thought. And the thing of Dragon Con, you'll always see cosplays you never expected to see. Like this last year, the one I specifically remember, one of my favorite movies is a Western, Tombstone. Val Kilmer plays a Doc Holliday, just a cowboy. There was a cosplay of that character there.
Wow.
So like you get random stuff like it's not just all sci-fi or fantasy stuff. It's just
Right.
anything you can think of, somebody's going to cosplay it there. It's amazing.
It's
You
awesome.
always every year there's something like I would never have thought I would have saw that in a million years, and then you see it,
Right.
and it's so cool. Yeah.
That's very awesome.
Well, I know we've been going for long, so is there, do y'all have any, I guess, closing remarks on the Path of Deceit that you'd like to touch on before we wrap up, or just the High Republic in general?
Uh, Read the books; they're incredible. I think if you never get into Star Wars books, I think this is a fun place to jump in because you really don't have to know much. You know, you don't have to really read any other Star Wars books. Just start with the High Republic and go from there because there's a lot of awesome new stuff in there.
I really agree with that because I know that's one thing. These books were probably the first time I felt like, oh, if I have some fans who just like reading but are not into Star Wars, I can actually tell them like, hey, read these books. You don't have to have ever seen the movies. You won't be lost at all. If you like sci-fi, I think you'll enjoy these books.
Yep.
Right.
I find this book indispensable in the High Republic.
Yeah.
It is one of my favorites of all of the levels, of all the middle grade, adult, and young adult. It is one of my favorites. I'm really, really
And
impressed with it.
I really,
I hope that there would be a panel in the future because I'm so curious about how the two authors wrote the book.
Yeah.
I would be really curious about that interaction because it's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, anytime I ever read a book that has multiple authors, that's always like I can't imagine like how did they do. To me, it's hard enough when you're writing like a big series like this where different authors are doing each book, but then having two people write a book, to me that is something amazing challenge. And at no point, sometimes I've read books by multiple people, and you clearly feel like, oh, this chapter was written by one of them because you can kind of tell they have different writing styles. I never felt like this the entire time of the book. I never would have been able to guess like, oh, this clearly whoever's writing it changed at this point.
right.
I agree. I read the Expanse novels. Do you know about the Expanse, Kyle?
I've seen the TV show. I've never read any of the books yet.
There are 9 novels, and that is another really good example of you can't really tell who is writing it because, and I've seen panels. They're editing each other constantly, and so that's why it has one sort of unified voice rather than two people trying to write a story. So anyway.
Cool. Well, I do want to encourage people. Obviously, we encourage people to read the High Republic. But if you haven't checked out Nick and Melo's amazing YouTube channel, definitely check them out. Is there anything y'all want to maybe y'all have planned for the remainder of the year that you want to give people a little, I guess, incentive to come visit your channel? Any topics you'll be exploring?
Well, we just released an episode on the High Republic novels of Phase 1 and a separate episode on the comics.
Yes.
So those are out. This coming week, we're releasing one about the Star Wars class that I teach.
Oh, awesome.
And there are a few other sort of fun things that we're doing, but we usually do 9 episodes a year, and we sort of do it fall through spring kind of thing. We release them every 2 weeks, and we have the attention span of a baby, so they're short. They're 20 to 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Is there a way for your non-college students to take your Star Wars class or see something from it? Because that sounds absolutely fascinating.
I've been trying to figure that out myself.
It is not online. But Kyle, if you're ever in Chicago, you would be a guest of honor in my class.
Awesome.
I've been trying to figure that out for 2 years now.
I think that would be awesome.
Let's see. For a college, I don't know if either of y'all read that. I've reviewed this on my channel. The History and Politics of Star Wars, Death and Democracy. So my college degree is in political science with a background like history. If you like that type of stuff, and it's fully a college book, all the annotations at the end, every chapter has annotations.
That's cool.
I felt like I was back in college when I was reading the book, but it's a fascinating book exploring the history and politics of Star Wars and how it intertwines with our world. At a time it joked when it came out, and I found it because somebody posted about it on Instagram. It's like if somebody had designed a nonfiction book for me to read, it's like, oh, he's a Star Wars fan and he has a political science degree. Like, oh, let's design a book specifically for Kyle and nobody else. It would be this book,
one.
you know? Yeah.
There is one also about the Clone Wars, about the show, the animated show.
Yeah.
That is a really interesting sort of poli-sci kind of book. Since you're plugging books, I'm going to plug my own book.
Excellent read.
It came out last summer. It's small, like everything I do to the moment. It came out last summer, and I use it in my class. And a lot of the ideas in here was that what sort of connected Nick and I together to start thinking about the podcast. So, and it's available on Amazon and online, and they're electronic copies. And I've been very proactive about asking people to order a copy for the public libraries in their cities.
Awesome.
Not everybody can afford the book, or not everybody wants to buy the book. So that's a good way of sort of spreading the word about the book.
Very much so. Well, I'll include probably somewhere up here links to y'all's channel so people can kind of check that out.
That would be awesome.
Yeah. And thanks for joining me today.
We're honored. Thank you so much.
How long we've been going? It's been going long. It was Nick. It was nice meeting you at DragonCon, and thanks for reaching out afterwards. And it's always nice to expand the connection with other Star Wars fans out there. So thank you again for reaching out. And this was a lot of fun. So again, everybody, please check out their YouTube channel. Read the High Republic if you haven't been reading yet, because it's some of the best Star Wars content that's ever been produced. So hope you enjoyed watching. I'll see you the next time, and may the Force be with you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
See you guys.